come to realize that these early archaeologists were themselves myth makers. And so one of the fascinating things about studying Minoan is that you're often untangling the myths, not only from early Greece, but also the myths which have come down from some of these archaeologists, Evans included. For over 3,700 years, 241 symbols stamped into a small clay disc have defeated every historian, linguist, and coderaker who ever tried to read them. Not one sentence, not one confirmed word. Then AI was set loose on it. Music. And within days, researchers were calling the results the biggest breakthrough in the disc's history. Historians are stunned. But decoded might be the wrong word for what actually happened. And the real discovery buried inside this story, music, is stranger and far more revealing than the translation everyone's been chasing for over a century. But this thing was found 1896 over by Newberry, Michigan. A couple of guys tipped over some trees. This thing was in the ground. It's got 140 characters on it. The discovery of the Phaistos Disc. In the summer of 1908, Italian archaeologist Luigi Peronier was excavating the ruins of the Minoan palace of Phaistos, one of the great administrative centers of Bronze Age Crete, when his team uncovered a strange round object buried in a storeroom. It was a disc of fired clay dating to roughly 1700 to 600 BC, the height of Minoan civilization. Is it even a writing system? Here's where the mystery gets even stranger. Because scholars don't just disagree about what the disc says. They disagree about what kind of object it even is. Over the decades, researchers have floated a wide range of music possibilities. Some have argued the disc is a religious hymn or prayer meant to be read aloud in a ceremonial setting. Others have suggested it's a ritual chant, less a written record than a script for something spoken or sung. Music, still others treat it as a purely administrative record, similar in function to the inventory tablets used elsewhere in the Minoan palace system, or as a kind of calendar tracking a recurring cycle of time. And then there's a theory that has resurfaced with new force recently. The idea that this small clay disc was never a text at all, but a board game. That last idea isn't new. Shortly after the disc's music discovery, Italian archaeologist Aleandro Decoded already noticed that its rigid segmented layout looked oddly similar to a game board and suggested it might be a rule-based music object rather than a piece of writing. For decades, that idea was pushed to the sidelines in favor of the more exciting possibility that the disc held a hidden written message. But in a study published in early 2026, researcher Konstantinos Razas revisited that old idea using 21st century tools, detailed manufacturing analysis, comparisons with known Bronze Age board games, and a close look at the disc's spatial layout. The study points out some genuinely odd features. The symbols are packed tightly into fixed compartments with no signs of correction or spacing adjustment, the way you'd expect from someone recording a spontaneous, music piece of language. The figures on the outer rim consistently face outward as if meant to be seen by an observer, while the inner spiral runs the opposite direction, a layout that fits more naturally with a device meant for people to interact with rather than a text meant to be silently read by one person alone. None of music. This proves the game theory is correct, but it illustrates something important. Even in 2026, more than 100 red years after its music discovery, scholars are still fundamentally unsure whether the Phaistos disc records language at all. That's the real mystery here. It's not just what does it say, it's does it say anything in the way we usually mean that phrase? How AI entered the investigation. Ancient script research has always relied heavily on the trained intuition of specialists. People who spend years staring at symbol shapes, memorizing where signs repeat, and building theories sign by sign, largely by hand, one comparison at a time. Computational methods change the scale of that process entirely. Modern tools can identify repeated symbol sequences across a text far faster than any human could manage. Compare grammatical style patterns like recurring prefixes and suffixes. Analyze how often each sign appears and where it tends to sit within a sequence. Test specific linguistic hypotheses directly against the data and statistically compare one script structure against other better understood ancient scripts. This isn't a hypothetical use of AI. It reflects a real and growing field. A 2024 review published in the journal Computational Linguistics cataloged the range of computational approaches researchers have applied specifically to Bronze Age Ion and Crete music, writing systems including the Phaistos Disc Linear A, Linear B, and Minoan. As the shock waves from the earthquake traveled across the land, they would have shaken these structures. And because they're quite rigid and brittle, the mortar in between would have collapsed. And this builds on real breakthroughs elsewhere. Music. In 2019, a team from MIT and Google built a machine learning system that could partially automate the decipherment process for lost languages, testing it successfully on Linear B and Ugaritic. In 2022, DeepMind-built AI system called Ithaca, described in the journal Nature, demonstrated it could help historians restore damaged ancient Greek inscriptions and estimate where and when they were originally written. None of these systems read minds or magically translate unknown scripts from nothing. What they do is something more specific and arguably more useful. They allow researchers to test thousands, sometimes millions of possible structural relationships between symbols far faster than manual analysis ever could. Surfacing patterns a human might take years to notice or might miss altogether. But here's the distinction that matters most, and the one that most viral headlines gloss over entirely. AI is testing hypothesis. It is not producing a verified translation. Those are two very different things. And mixing them up is exactly how genuine scientific progress turns into misleading headlines. The most interesting findings so far. So what has this kind of computational analysis actually turned up when applied to scripts like the Phaistos Disc? A possible relationship to linear. One of the most interesting threads in recent research is the question of whether the Phaistos Disc's underlying structure has any statistical relationship to linear, the still undeciphered administrative script used elsewhere in Minoan Crete. Linear A itself remains unsolved, but it has something the Phaistos Disc doesn't. Multiple inscriptions to compare against each other found on tablets, seals, and vessels across the island. Researchers exploring this question aren't claiming a translation. What they're testing is narrower and more careful. Whether the way symbols cluster and repeat on the disc looks more like the patterns found in Linear A than you'd expect from random chance. Even a modest structural echo between the two would be meaningful. It wouldn't tell us what the disc says, but it could tell us what kind of writing system, if any, we're dealing with in the first place. Pattern recognition within the disc itself separately from the linear. A question. Computational analysis of the disc's own internal structure has highlighted a few consistent patterns. Recurring groups of signs that behave the way words behave in known music languages. Repeated sequences that sit in the position you'd expect a prefix or suffix to occupy, and structural regularities and how signs are distributed across the spiral. Findings like these don't decode music anything on their own, but they do push back against one alternative theory. The idea that the disc symbols are essentially decorative or random. Music, structural regularity of the kind a computer can measure precisely across the entire object at once. Music is generally considered a hallmark of an organized communication system, even before you know what that system actually communicates. Competing translations. If you spend any time searching for information on the Phaistos Disc, you'll quickly run into no shortage of confident-sounding translations. Over the decades, independent music researchers have proposed that the disc contains a hymn, a prayer, an agricultural record, a property or goods inventory, a calendar, a legal text, even a military document. More recently, some researchers using computational or AI-assisted tools, music, have proposed their own readings, framing the disc as a sacred hymn, an administrative device, or a symbolic narrative describing events or beliefs. Here's the important thing to understand about all of these. Not one of music, them has been accepted by the wider academic community. Some proposed decipherments rely on comparing the Phaistos Discus, music, symbols to entirely different much later languages. Greek dialects, Luwian, music, even Foich languages using visual symbol matching methods that most epigraphers consider far too speculative to be reliable, given how easy it is to force a resemblance between unrelated symbol sets. If you look hard enough and music, want to find one. This is actually a really important pattern to notice because it happens with almost every undeciphered script in history. And we know that is spelled like kuro, the word for deficit most probably which is ko. And then there are many personal names, music, and place names. When a text resists translation for long enough, it doesn't just attract careful scholarship. It also attracts a steady stream of enthusiastic, often contradictory solutions, each confident, each different from the last, and each ultimately unconfirmed. The sheer number of competing translations for the Phaistos Disc, music spanning wildly different languages and interpretations, is itself one of the clearest signs that we're music still nowhere near consensus. Why historians aren't actually speechless. Historians studying the Phaistos Disc, music, are not walking around stunned into silence because AI cracked an ancient code. That's not what's happening, and any claim that says otherwise should make you skeptical. What is actually happening is more measured, but genuinely exciting if you understand music, what it means. Researchers working on undeciphered scripts are excited because computational tools give them a new kind of instrument, not a final answer. AI allows scholars to test competing hypotheses about the disk structure far faster than manual analysis allows. To rule out unlikely interpretations by checking them against the data at scale. To detect subtle structural patterns hidden across the whole object that a human working sign by sign could easily miss. And to reconstruct possible statistical relationships between the disk and other ion scripts, music, like linear A. That's genuinely valuable work. It's just not the same thing as a decipherment. The scholarly consensus, as of today, remains unchanged. The Phaistos Disc is officially undeciphered. No institution, music museum, or peer-reviewed academic body has confirmed a translation. If that changes, it will be a major event in the history of archaeology. But we are not there yet. Why the disc matters? Given all this uncertainty, it's worth pausing to ask. Why do people care so much about one small clay disc? The answer is what it could unlock if it were ever properly understood. The Minoans were one of the great early civilizations of the Ion based on Sit, and they left behind spectacular palaces, vivid fresco, and intricate art. But because so much of their writing remains undeciphered, both linear A and even more so the Phaistos Disc, huge parts of their inner world remain closed off to us. We can see what they built and painted. We have a much harder time hearing what they actually said. If the Phaistos Disc were ever conclusively translated, it could offer a direct window into Minoan religious beliefs and practices, the structure of their political or administrative systems, how goods, land, or resources were recorded and managed, details of their language itself, one of the least understood in the ancient Mediterranean, trade relationships with neighboring civilizations, or specific ceremonial or ritual practices tied to the palace at Phaistos. Sit with that for a second. Somewhere on that spiral of 241 symbols could be an actual voice, a name, a request, a plea to a god, a record of a debt owed, or a harvest counted. Real people pressed these symbols into wet clay with their own hands, believing whoever read it next would understand exactly what they meant. Instead, that message has been sitting in silence for 3 and 12,000 years, fully intact, perfectly preserved, and completely unheard. It isn't lost. It's just locked. And every civilization we've ever managed to hear from, the Egyptians, the Sumerians, the Maya, was once exactly this quiet, right up until the moment somebody finally found the key. Even a partial breakthrough would meaningfully deepen our understanding of Bronze Age Crete and its place among the wider network of ancient Mediterranean and Near Eastern civilizations. That's the Raal Prize driving all this research. Not the disc itself, but everything it might be able to tell us about the people who made it. Could AI eventually solve it? So, will AI actually crack the Phaistos Disc one day? Music researchers in this field are cautiously optimistic, but their optimism comes with a very specific condition attached. The path forward, most agree, will likely come from combining several things at once. AI-driven pattern analysis, high-resolution imaging that can capture even the faintest details of the disk surface, traditional archaeological fieldwork, comparative linguistics, drawing on related scripts like linear A, and critically the discovery of new inscriptions. And here's the ironic part. The biggest obstacle to solving the Phaistos Disc isn't computing power. Modern computational tools are already vastly more capable than anything available to researchers a century ago or even a decade ago. The real obstacle is the same one that's existed since 1908. There simply isn't enough text. One disk, 241 signs, no companions. If archaeologists were ever to uncover another artifact using the same script, even a small fragment, even a handful of new symbols in the same style, the odds of eventually cracking this system would increase dramatically. Every additional piece of comparable text makes the statistical case for or against any proposed decipherment enormously stronger. Right now, researchers are working with the linguistic equivalent of a single fingerprint. AI can analyze that fingerprint with incredible precision, but no amount of computing power can invent the second and third fingerprints needed to confirm a match. Artificial intelligence hasn't translated the Phaistos Disc, but it has changed how one of Archaeology's greatest mysteries is being investigated. After more than a century of failed decipherment attempts, researchers are finally uncovering statistical patterns hidden within the symbols. Patterns no human researcher working sign by sign could have reliably spotted alone. Whether those patterns ultimately help unlock the language of the Minoans, confirm that the disc was never a language at all, or reveal something else entirely remains one of the most exciting unanswered questions in ancient history. And somewhere in a museum in Heraclean, Crete, that small disc of fired clay is still sitting there, 3,700 years old, 241 symbols strong, and still for now keeping its secret. If you want to be here the moment that secret finally cracks, whether it's a new fragment pulled out of the Cretan soil or the next AI model that gets a little closer than the last one, subscribe now because the next undeciphered mystery we cover might be the one that finally breaks wide open.